On a scorching Texas highway, Michael Thompson's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel as his pickup truck screamed to a halt, dust exploding around him like a prayer answered too late. Two German Shepherd puppies stood upright on their hind legs in the middle of the asphalt, tiny paws pressed together as if begging God himself for mercy. This wasn't roadkill or abandonment, this was something far worse. The smaller puppy collapsed from exhaustion, its whimper cutting through the desert silence like a blade. The larger one stumbled toward Michael's truck door, desperation carved into its innocent brown eyes, leading him toward the tall grass where something unspeakable waited. At 68, Michael had buried his wife, his son, and his faith in humanity. But those pleading eyes reminded him of David's last moments, of Martha's final breath, of every prayer he'd whispered into the void. "Dear God," he whispered, following the puppies into the ditch. What he discovered there would either destroy what remained of his broken heart or teach him that sometimes salvation comes on four legs, covered in blood. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Michael Thompson had been a different man. At 68, the retired elementary school teacher from Cedar Creek, Texas, had spent 35 years shaping young minds at the local school, earning the nickname Mr. Mike from generations of students who remembered his patient smile and unwavering belief that no child was beyond saving. His modest white house on Maple Street, with its wraparound porch and picket fence, had once been the heart of the neighborhood, filled with the laughter of visiting students, the aroma of Martha's famous apple pie, and the gentle hum of a life well lived. But that was before cancer stole Martha 3 years ago, leaving behind only her dying rose garden and the hollow echo of Michael's footsteps in rooms that suddenly felt too large. Before the car accident claimed their son David 10 years prior, crushing the dreams of a 32-year-old man who'd wanted nothing more than to follow his father's path into teaching. Now the 4-bedroom house stood as a monument to loss, its empty rooms collecting dust and memories that cut deeper with each passing day. Michael's daily routine had shrunk to the bare minimum: coffee at 5 in the morning while reading yesterday's newspaper, tending Martha's struggling roses with hands that shook more each month, and counting the $1,247 Social Security check that barely covered his heart medication and utilities. The kitchen table, once set for family dinners, now held only a single plate, a lonely coffee cup, and bottles of pills that kept his damaged heart beating one reluctant day at a time. Cedar Creek itself was dying alongside its longtime residents. The town of 3,200 souls, 45 miles southeast of Austin, watched its younger families migrate to the city while its elderly population clung to memories of better times. Main Street storefronts stood empty, their faded signs advertising businesses that had closed when Walmart opened in the next county. And the farming community that had once thrived on cattle ranches and cotton fields now struggled against corporate agriculture and drought. Michael hadn't driven beyond the town limits since Martha's funeral. The world outside Cedar Creek felt foreign and threatening, filled with strangers who couldn't possibly understand the weight of surviving when everyone you loved was gone. His doctor appointments in Austin had been postponed repeatedly, each excuse easier than facing the hour-long drive that reminded him of hospital visits and funeral arrangements. In his wallet, folded behind his driver's license, sat a faded photograph of happier times. Martha in her yellow sundress, David at age 7 missing his front teeth, and Michael himself with hair still more brown than gray. Next to it, Martha's emergency fund, $3,847 in cash she'd saved over 20 years, for when we really need it, she'd always said. Michael had never touched a dollar of it, even when the mortgage payment was late or the car needed repairs. The money felt sacred, untouchable, a final connection to the woman who'd believed in planning for tomorrow even when today felt impossible to bear. The doctor's appointment had been inevitable. 3 months of postponed visits, ignored reminder calls, and chest pains that left Michael gasping in his garden had finally forced him into his rusty Ford pickup on this sweltering September afternoon. Highway 21 stretched endlessly ahead, shimmering with heat waves that made the asphalt dance like water. At 94 degrees, even the air conditioning in his 20-year-old truck struggled against the Texas sun. Michael gripped the steering wheel with hands that trembled slightly. Whether from anxiety about the drive or his worsening heart condition, he couldn't tell. The prescription bottles in his glove compartment rattled with each bump in the road, a constant reminder of his mortality. He'd made this drive countless times with Martha, her hand resting on his knee while she hummed along to old country songs on the radio. Now, the silence felt suffocating. His mind wandered to the morning's routine. Coffee black because he'd forgotten to buy cream, toast dry because butter was an expense he'd started skipping. The roses Martha had planted 20 years ago were dying despite his efforts, their brown edges mocking his inability to keep anything alive. Even the house seemed to be giving up, paint peeling from the shutters, gutters sagging under the weight of autumn leaves he no longer had the energy to clean. That's when he saw them. Two small shapes in the middle of the highway, too far away to identify but close enough to send his heart hammering against his ribs. Michael squinted through the dusty windshield, his foot instinctively moving toward the brake pedal. As the distance closed, the impossible scene came into focus. Two German Shepherd puppies, no more than 8 weeks old, standing upright on their hind legs in perfect symmetry. The brakes screamed as Michael's truck shuddered to a violent stop, dust exploding around him in a choking cloud. His heart pounded so hard he feared another episode, but adrenaline overrode caution as he threw open the door and stumbled onto the scorching pavement. The puppies didn't scatter as he'd expected. Instead, they approached with uncertain steps, their tiny bodies trembling with exhaustion and heat. The larger one, cream-colored with darker markings around intelligent brown eyes, stood on wobbly hind legs and placed muddy paws against Michael's worn jeans. The smaller puppy, slightly more golden in color, attempted a small leap toward his outstretched hand, whimpering softly. "Easy, little ones," Michael whispered, his voice hoarse from surprise and the desert heat. His teacher's instincts kicked in, the same gentle tone he'd used with frightened children on their first day of school. "What are you doing out here?" But these weren't ordinary strays begging for food or water. Their behavior was purposeful, urgent. They looked at him with an intensity that seemed far beyond their weeks of life, then turned toward the roadside ditch, looking back over their shoulders as if willing him to follow. The larger puppy took several steps toward the tall grass, stopped, and looked back again with unmistakable desperation. Martha's voice echoed in his memory. "You always were a sucker for anything helpless, Michael Thompson." She'd said it about the countless stray cats he'd fed, the injured birds he'd nursed back to health, the troubled students he'd never given up on. Maybe that's why these puppies had chosen him. Against his better judgment and his doctor's appointment that was now 20 minutes overdue, Michael followed the tiny guides into the ditch beside Highway 21. The grass was tall and sharp, cutting through his thin slacks as he pushed deeper into what looked like an abandoned campsite. Empty cans scattered among the weeds, a torn blue tarp stretched between fence posts, and a dented metal water bowl that had been licked bone dry. That's when he saw Thunder. The adult German Shepherd lay motionless beneath the makeshift shelter, his magnificent black and tan coat matted with blood and dirt. Even unconscious, he was impressive. Easily 75 pounds of muscle and bone, with the distinctive pointed ears and intelligent face of his breed. But something was horribly wrong. His ribs rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths, and dark stains spread across his fur from multiple wounds. Michael dropped to his knees beside the injured dog, his own health forgotten in the face of such suffering. Rope burns circled Thunder's neck where a collar had been yanked too tight, his left front leg bent at an unnatural angle, and flies buzzed around wounds that looked deliberately inflicted rather than accidental. This wasn't roadkill or natural death, this was cruelty, pure and calculated. The two puppies pressed against Thunder's still form, their tiny noses nudging his face as if trying to wake their protector. Michael's throat constricted as he recognized the scene. Children trying desperately to rouse a parent who might never wake up again. He'd lived this nightmare in hospital rooms, watched David's machines fall silent, felt Martha's hand grow cold in his. "I've got you now," Michael whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to Thunder or to himself. Dr. Sarah Martinez had performed thousands of examinations in her 15 years as a veterinarian, but the unconscious German Shepherd on her table presented mysteries that made her pause. Thunder's injuries were severe: 3 broken ribs, internal bleeding, severe dehydration, but it was the embedded microchip that would change everything. The scanner beeped softly as it detected the electronic signature, and Sarah's eyes widened as the information populated her computer screen. "Thunder, badge number K9447, Austin Police Department," she read aloud to her assistant, her voice catching with surprise. "Service record: 8 years, narcotics detection, multiple commendations for bravery." The screen continued scrolling, revealing a distinguished career that had ended abruptly 18 months earlier with a single line: "Handler, Officer James Rodriguez. Deceased, line of duty." Michael Thompson sat in the plastic chair beside the examination table, his weathered hands clasping and unclasping as he processed this revelation. The dog he'd found dying beside a Texas highway wasn't just another abandoned animal. He was a decorated hero who'd served his community with distinction. The magnitude of Thunder's fall from grace hit Michael like a physical blow, from respected canine officer to discarded victim of human cruelty. "Officer Rodriguez was killed during a drug raid gone wrong," Dr. Martinez explained gently, pulling up additional records on her computer. "Thunder was there when it happened. The department tried to retire him to a loving family, but—" She paused, reading further. "Oh, he escaped from his new home 6 months ago. No one's seen him since." Michael's throat tightened as he imagined Thunder's journey from that moment of loss to this table. The dog had lost his partner, his purpose, his home, and finally his health to human cruelty. It was a story Michael understood intimately, the way grief could hollow you out, make you vulnerable to dangers you'd once easily avoided. "He's been wandering for 6 months," Michael whispered. "Alone, grieving, probably looking for his partner." The financial reality hit him when Dr. Martinez delivered the treatment estimate. Thunder needed immediate surgery to repair internal damage, followed by weeks of recovery and rehabilitation. The total cost? $3,200. Michael's monthly Social Security check was $1,247. His savings account contained exactly $73. But folded in his wallet, preserved behind his driver's license like a sacred relic, was Martha's emergency fund, 20 years of careful saving, dollar by dollar, for when we really need it. "My wife would say this qualifies," Michael said quietly, pulling out the worn bills that smelled faintly of Martha's perfume. He counted out the exact amount, while Dr. Martinez watched with professional compassion. She'd seen people make difficult financial choices for their pets before, but this elderly man spending his life savings for a dog he'd known for 3 hours touched something deeper than professional admiration. The surgery authorization forms felt heavy in Michael's trembling hands. By signing them, He was committing to more than just Thunder's medical care. He was accepting responsibility for Max and Duke, agreeing to follow up treatments he couldn't afford, and betting his financial security on the survival of a dog who might not make it through the night. "There's something else," Dr. Martinez said as Michael finished signing. Thunder's police training included psychological conditioning. Dogs like him form intense bonds with their handlers. When Officer Rodriguez died, Thunder didn't just lose a partner, he lost his entire sense of purpose. The trauma of that loss, combined with whatever abuse he suffered recently, means his recovery won't just be physical. Michael nodded, understanding more than the veterinarian realized. He'd felt that same purposelessness after losing Martha and David, the way each morning became a question of why bother getting up at all. The difference was that Thunder still had a chance at a new beginning, while Michael had resigned himself to simply enduring until the end. As Thunder was prepared for surgery, Michael made arrangements for Max and Duke. The puppies had been remarkably well behaved during the clinic visit, as if they understood the gravity of their situation. Dr. Martinez's assistant helped load them into Michael's truck along with donated food, toys, and basic supplies that the clinic kept for emergency situations. The drive home to Cedar Creek felt surreal. Michael glanced in his rearview mirror at 2 German Shepherd puppies who'd somehow become his responsibility, while 30 miles behind him their protector fought for life under surgical lights. His house, which had echoed with silence for 3 years, was about to be invaded by creatures who would need feeding, training, and constant attention. Mrs. Henderson was waiting on his front porch when he arrived, having heard through the small-town network that Mr. Mike had gotten himself involved in some kind of animal situation. Her arthritis-gnarled hands helped carry the puppies inside, and her practical wisdom took over where Michael's inexperience faltered. "These babies need routine," she declared, setting up feeding stations in the kitchen while Max and Duke explored their new environment with cautious optimism. "Dogs are like children. They need to know what's expected and when to expect it. You taught kindergarten for 30 years, Michael Thompson. This isn't so different." But it was different. Students went home at the end of the day. These puppies would need him at 5 a.m. and midnight and every hour in between. They would need vaccinations he couldn't afford, training he didn't know how to provide, and love he wasn't sure he still had to give. As he watched Duke curl up in the corner where Martha's Hope chest used to sit, Michael wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. The call from Dr. Martinez came at 11 p.m. Thunder had survived the surgery, but the next 48 hours would be critical. "He's stable," she reported, "but he's not responding to staff. He seems to be waiting for something or someone." Michael understood. Thunder was waiting for his handler to come back, just as Michael had spent 3 years waiting for Martha's key in the front door lock. Some kinds of waiting could kill you if you weren't careful, but other kinds, the kind where you waited for a new reason to keep fighting, those might save your life. The first 72 hours after Thunder's surgery blurred together in a haze of antiseptic smells and fluorescent lighting. Michael had claimed the uncomfortable vinyl chair in the emergency clinic's waiting room as his personal territory, refusing Dr. Martinez's gentle suggestions that he go home and rest. His weathered hands clutched a paper coffee cup that had gone cold hours ago, his eyes fixed on the steel door that separated him from Thunder's recovery kennel. "Mr. Thompson, you really should get some sleep," Dr. Martinez said for the 3rd time that morning, her scrubs wrinkled from the all-night surgery. "Thunder is stable now. The internal bleeding has stopped, and we've set the ribs. He's going to make it." But Michael had heard similar words before, in hospital corridors when Martha fought her final battle, in emergency rooms after David's accident. He'd learned that stable could change to critical in heartbeats, that going to make it was sometimes just kindness wrapped in false hope. "I'll stay," he said simply, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had kept third graders in line for 35 years. Thunder's reaction to the veterinary staff troubled everyone. The magnificent German Shepherd, even weakened by surgery and medication, displayed an aggression that seemed born of deep trauma rather than typical animal fear. He'd snap at anyone who approached his kennel, his lip curling back to reveal impressive canines that had once served the Austin Police Department. But when Michael entered the recovery area, something extraordinary happened. Thunder's ears would prick forward, his brown eyes would soften, and he'd struggle to lift his head in recognition. "I've never seen anything like it," Dr. Martinez confided to her assistant within Michael's earshot. "It's as if that dog knows Mr. Thompson saved his life." Meanwhile, Max and Duke had transformed Michael's quiet house into a whirlwind of destruction and unexpected joy. The two puppies, still grieving their protector's absence, channeled their anxiety into exploring every corner of the home that had sat silent for 3 years. Martha's antique quilt, carefully preserved on the living room sofa, now bore muddy paw prints. Her china cabinet had been investigated thoroughly, resulting in one broken teacup that Michael found himself grateful to lose. It had been too painful to use anyway. The puppy's 5 a.m. feeding schedule forced Michael back into a routine he'd forgotten he missed. For the first time since Martha's death, he had reasons to wake up, to plan his day around something other than his own grief. Duke, the smaller and more timid of the two, seemed to understand Michael's fragile state and would curl up beside him during the difficult evening hours when loneliness hit hardest. Max, bolder and more adventurous, had appointed himself guardian of the house, barking at every unfamiliar sound with the fierce protectiveness of his breed. By the end of the first week, the financial reality of Michael's decision began to sink in. Thunder's surgery had cost exactly $3,200, every dollar of Martha's emergency fund plus $53 from his checking account. The puppies required food, supplies, and their own veterinary care. His monthly Social Security check, already stretched thin, now had to cover expenses he'd never budgeted for. The story of the retired teacher who'd spent his life savings to save a police dog spread through Cedar Creek with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. Mrs. Henderson from next door appeared on his doorstep with a bag of puppy food and tears in her eyes. "Martha would be so proud," she said, pressing the bag into his hands despite his protests about charity. The local diner started serving a Thunder Burger with $1 from each sale going to Michael's mounting veterinary bills. The high school students organized car washes, and the Methodist Church added Thunder to their prayer list right alongside the sick and bereaved. Social media picked up the story when someone shared a photo of the two puppies standing guard beside Thunder's empty kennel, and suddenly, donations began trickling in from across Texas. It was during this groundswell of community support that Rick Morrison first learned about the story. Serving a 30-day sentence in the county jail for his third DUI, Rick had plenty of time to read every word of the Cedar Creek Gazette. The headline, "Retired Teacher Spends Life Savings to Save Hero Dog," might as well have been a punch to his gut. Rick remembered Mr. Thompson clearly, the patient teacher who'd never raised his voice, never gave up on the angry 6-year-old who'd come to school hungry and bruised more often than not. Michael Thompson had been the first adult to treat Rick with consistent kindness, packing extra sandwiches in his lunch and keeping spare clothes in his desk for the days when Rick arrived in yesterday's wrinkled outfit. But kindness hadn't been enough to save Rick from the path he'd chosen. Dropping out of high school, a string of failed jobs, marriages that ended in restraining orders, and a relationship with alcohol that had defined his adult life. At 45, Rick had nothing to show for his existence except a criminal record and the crushing knowledge that he'd disappointed everyone who'd ever believed in him. Reading about Thunder's rescue triggered something dark in Rick's damaged psyche. Here was a dog, an animal, receiving more compassion, more community support, more genuine care than Rick had experienced in decades. The injustice of it consumed him, feeding the resentment that had been growing since his latest arrest. Back at the veterinary clinic, Thunder's recovery took an unexpected turn during his second week. Despite healing physically, the dog began displaying signs of what Dr. Martinez recognized as canine PTSD. Thunder would wake from nightmares, his powerful body trembling as phantom threats played out in his dreams. He refused to eat unless Michael hand-fed him, and his protective instincts around the puppies had intensified to concerning levels. "It's not uncommon in police dogs," Dr. Martinez explained to Michael during one of their evening consultations. Thunder served 8 years detecting drugs, facing dangerous situations. Then he lost his handler, was rehomed with a family that probably meant well but didn't understand his needs. The abuse he suffered was likely the final trauma that broke his ability to trust. Michael understood trauma intimately. His own nights were haunted by Martha's labored breathing in her final days, by the phone call that had shattered his world when David's accident stole his son's future. Some wounds never fully healed. They just learned to coexist with the beating of your heart. The bond between Michael and Thunder deepened during those quiet hospital visits. Michael would read aloud from the newspaper, his voice providing comfort to the anxious dog. He'd talk about Martha, about David, about the students he'd taught over the decades. Thunder would listen with the intense focus that had made him an excellent police dog, his eyes never leaving Michael's face. "You understand loss, don't you, boy?" Michael would whisper during their evening conversations. "You know what it feels like when everyone you love disappears." By the third week, Thunder's medical bills had climbed beyond anything Michael could have imagined. An infection at the surgical site required additional treatment. Specialized medications, extended hospitalization, and around-the-clock monitoring had pushed the total cost to nearly $5,000. The community fundraising had reached $2,847, but it wasn't enough. Michael sat in his kitchen one evening, calculator and bills spread across Martha's old tablecloth, running numbers that wouldn't balance no matter how many times he tried. His heart medication alone cost $180 per month. The house needed repairs he'd been postponing. His own health was declining under the stress, and he hadn't seen his cardiologist in months. The practical solution was obvious and heartbreaking. Surrender Thunder to the county animal shelter once he was healthy enough for adoption. A younger family with more resources could provide better care. The decision made financial sense, but it felt like another death in a life that had already buried too much love. That night, Thunder seemed to sense Michael's internal struggle. During visiting hours, the dog rested his magnificent head on Michael's lap with unusual gentleness, those intelligent brown eyes conveying understanding that transcended species. Max and Duke, as if responding to some invisible signal, pressed closer to Michael's legs, their warm bodies offering comfort they somehow knew he needed. "We're in this together," Michael whispered to his unexpected family, making a decision that defied logic but honored something deeper than financial responsibility. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Unknown to Michael, Rick Morrison had been released from county jail that afternoon, and Rick had been thinking about Mr. Thompson's precious dogs for 30 solid days. Rick Morrison walked out of the county jail into the blazing afternoon sun, his possessions contained in a paper bag that held everything the world had left him: a wallet with $7, a flip phone with a cracked screen, and the business card of a parole officer who'd already written him off as another repeat offender. The 30 days in lockup had done nothing to address the demons that drove him to drink. If anything, the forced sobriety had sharpened his focus on every bitter disappointment that defined his 45 years of existence. The story about Michael Thompson and Thunder had consumed Rick's thoughts throughout his incarceration. Every night in his narrow bunk, he'd replayed the newspaper articles that fellow inmates read aloud with mockery in their voices. "Look at this," they'd laugh. "Whole town raising money for a mutt while we can't even get decent food in here." But Rick wasn't laughing. The image of his former teacher, the man who'd shown him more kindness than his own father ever had, lavishing attention and resources on a dog, felt like a personal betrayal. By evening, Rick had already violated his parole conditions. The first beer went down like salvation at Murphy's Bar, a dive that catered to men like him who had nowhere else to belong. The second beer loosened his tongue enough to start complaining to anyone who'd listen about the injustice of a world that cared more about animals than people. By the fourth beer, he was driving despite his suspended license, heading toward Maple Street with a vague plan forming in his alcohol-clouded mind. Michael's house looked exactly as Rick remembered from childhood. The white picket fence, the wraparound porch, the American flag hanging from a bracket beside the front door. But now there were signs of change. A dog run constructed along the side yard, food and water bowls on the porch, and the unmistakable sounds of puppies playing in the backyard. Rick parked across the street, engine running, watching the domestic scene with growing resentment. Meanwhile, the community controversy that had been simmering beneath Cedar Creek's surface finally erupted at the monthly town council meeting. Council member Patricia Hendricks, known for her fiscal conservatism and sharp tongue, had called for a public discussion about resource allocation after receiving complaints from several residents about the attention given to Thunder's situation. "I'm not heartless," Patricia declared to the packed meeting room, her voice carrying over the murmur of disagreement. "But we have elderly residents who can't afford their medications, children who need school supplies, and infrastructure that's crumbling. Are we really going to keep raising money for a dog when human beings in our own community are suffering?" The room erupted in heated debate. Supporters of Thunder, led by Mrs. Henderson and several of Michael's former teaching colleagues, argued passionately about community values and caring for those who had served. Opponents questioned the wisdom of spending thousands on veterinary bills when the same money could fund meals for struggling families or repairs to the community center. Michael, who had reluctantly attended the meeting at Dr. Martinez's urging, listened to the arguments with growing discomfort. He hadn't asked for this controversy, hadn't wanted to become a symbol of anything larger than one man trying to do right by a suffering animal. When called upon to speak, he rose slowly, his heart medication making him lightheaded under the fluorescent lights. "Thunder served this community for 8 years, Michael said, his teacher's voice carrying clearly through the room. "He put his life at risk every day to keep drugs off our streets, to protect our children. When Officer Rodriguez died, Thunder lost everything, his purpose, his partner, his home. If we turn our backs on him now, what does that say about who we are?" The applause was mixed with grumbling, the room clearly divided. Patricia Hendricks wasn't finished. "That's very touching, Mr. Thompson, but sentiment doesn't pay bills. How much more are we expected to contribute? Where does it end?" Back at the veterinary clinic, Thunder's behavior had taken a concerning turn. Dr. Martinez noticed increased agitation, restless pacing despite his healing injuries, and hypervigilant scanning of his surroundings. The dog's police training was reasserting itself, as if he sensed a threat that humans couldn't detect. "He's exhibiting classic signs of anxiety, Doctor," Martinez explained to Michael during their evening consultation. "Something has him on high alert. In working dogs, this usually indicates they've picked up on environmental cues that suggest danger." Michael dismissed the concern as recovery-related stress, but Thunder's behavior was becoming increasingly specific. The dog positioned himself between Michael and any strangers, his body language shifting into the alert stance he'd once used during drug raids. During visiting hours, Thunder would focus intently on sounds from the parking lot, his ears tracking movements that seemed random to human observers. The financial crisis reached its peak when Dr. Martinez delivered devastating news. Thunder had developed a post-surgical infection that required immediate intervention. The antibiotics alone would cost $800, with additional fees for extended hospitalization and monitoring. Michael's already depleted resources couldn't stretch to cover another emergency. "I understand this is difficult," Dr. Martinez said gently, her professional compassion evident in every word. "But without treatment, the infection could become life-threatening. We have payment plans available or—" She hesitated, knowing how her next words would wound. "The county animal shelter has arrangements for cases like this. They could assume financial responsibility and find Thunder an adoptive family once he's recovered." Michael's hands trembled as he signed the authorization for treatment, knowing he was committing to debt he couldn't afford. His checking account balance had dwindled to $73, his next Social Security payment still 2 weeks away. The practical voice in his head, the one that sounded remarkably like Martha during their leanest years, screamed that he was being foolishly irresponsible. That evening, as Michael sat beside Thunder's kennel reading aloud from a biography of Winston Churchill, he made a decision that surprised even himself. "We're going to figure this out," he told the attentive dog. "I couldn't save David, couldn't keep Martha from slipping away, but I can fight for you. We both deserve a second chance at family." Unknown to Michael, Rick Morrison had spent the previous night parked outside the veterinary clinic, noting the staff schedule and security measures. His plan was forming with the methodical patience of someone who had nothing left to lose. The hunting rifle he'd purchased from a pawn shop with his last paycheck lay across the passenger seat of his rusted Camaro, and the half-empty bottle of whiskey on the dashboard provided courage for what he intended to do. Rick's twisted logic had crystallized during his surveillance. If Michael Thompson cared more about a dog than he'd ever cared about his troubled students, then taking away that dog would be perfect justice. The teacher who'd failed to save one of his children from a life of disappointment and addiction would learn what real loss felt like. On the 18th night since Thunder's rescue, Rick made his move. Michael had established a routine of evening visits after the clinic's official hours, arriving around 8 p.m. when staff was minimal, and he could spend uninterrupted time with Thunder and update him on Max and Duke's progress at home. The parking lot was nearly empty when Michael's pickup truck arrived, and Rick Morrison stepped out of the shadows with a rifle in his hands and 20 years of accumulated rage burning in his bloodshot eyes. "Hello, Mr. Thompson," Rick said, his voice slurred by alcohol but steady with purpose. "Remember me? Little Ricky Morrison from your kindergarten class? The one who wasn't worth saving?" Michael's recognition was immediate and horrifying. The boy who'd sat in the front row because he couldn't see the board clearly, who'd fallen asleep during story time because he rarely got adequate rest at home, who'd shown such promise in his drawings and creative writing before life's circumstances crushed his potential. That sweet, troubled child had grown into the man now pointing a weapon at him in a veterinary clinic parking lot. "Rick," Michael said softly, using the same gentle tone that had once coaxed this man through difficult lessons. "What are you doing here?" Inside the clinic, Thunder's agitation reached a crescendo. The dog Dr. Martinez had described as anxious was now throwing himself against his kennel door with desperate fury, his barks echoing through the building in warning calls that spoke to instincts honed by years of police work. Thunder had sensed the danger long before it materialized, and now his protective training was screaming at him to reach the man who'd saved his life. The confrontation in the veterinary clinic parking lot unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a nightmare. Rick Morrison stood 15 feet from Michael's truck, the hunting rifle wavering in his unsteady hands as 20 years of accumulated bitterness poured out in a torrent of slurred accusations and alcohol-fueled rage. "You remember now, don't you?" Rick's voice cracked with the pain of a 6-year-old boy who'd never learned to process abandonment. Little Ricky, who couldn't read fast enough, couldn't sit still, couldn't be the perfect student you wanted. You gave up on me, just like everyone else. Michael's heart hammered against his ribs, but his teacher's instincts overrode his fear. He'd faced angry parents, desperate children, and hostile administrators throughout his career, and he recognized the wounded animal behind Rick's aggression. "I never gave up on you, Rick. I fought for you every day until your family moved away. I called the school district to make sure you got the help you needed." "Liar!" Rick screamed, the rifle jerking dangerously as his emotions spiraled beyond control. "You forgot about me the minute I walked out that classroom door. But a damn dog gets your life savings, gets the whole town crying over him. What about the kids like me? What about the ones who needed saving?" Inside the clinic, Thunder's desperate barking had reached a fever pitch. Dr. Martinez, working late to check on post-surgical patients, rushed to investigate the commotion. Through the window, she saw the armed confrontation and immediately called 911, her whispered reports competing with Thunder's increasingly frantic attempts to break free from his kennel. Michael took a careful step toward Rick, his hands raised in the universal gesture of peace. "You're right to be angry, Rick. The system failed you, and I'm sorry I couldn't do more. But hurting me won't heal what's broken inside you. Let me help you now." "Help me?" Rick laughed bitterly, tears streaming down his face as the rifle swung wildly. 30 years too late for that, Mr. Thompson. You want to save something? Try saving yourself." The first shot exploded into the night sky, a warning that shattered windows in the clinic and sent Thunder into a fury of protective rage. The German Shepherd threw his 75-pound body against the kennel door with such force that the metal hinges began to buckle. His police training had taken over completely. Somewhere in the darkness, his partner was in mortal danger. Michael dove behind his truck as Rick chambered another round, the alcohol making him clumsy but no less dangerous. "Rick, please, think about what you're doing. This isn't who you are." "You don't know who I am," Rick roared, advancing toward the truck with unsteady steps. "You knew who I was for 9 months when I was 6 years old. The rest of my life has been one long lesson in disappointment. Failed marriages, lost jobs, kids who won't speak to me. You know what I became, Mr. Thompson? Nothing. Absolutely nothing." The sound of Thunder breaking free from his kennel reverberated through the clinic like a thunderclap. Despite his recent surgery, despite the infection still coursing through his system, the police dog's protective instincts had overridden every limitation. He burst through the clinic's front door as Dr. Martinez fumbled with locks and security systems, his powerful frame moving with deadly purpose toward the man threatening his savior. Rick spun toward the sound, his finger tightening on the trigger as Thunder launched himself across the parking lot. The second shot caught Thunder in the shoulder, spinning him sideways but not stopping his momentum. 75 pounds of trained protection dog collided with Rick Morrison, driving him to the asphalt as the rifle skittered away into the darkness. The impact sent a shock wave of agony through Michael's chest, not from physical injury, but from the terrible recognition of trauma repeating itself. The phone call 10 years ago that had shattered his world, the doctor's measured voice explaining that David's car had been found wrapped around a tree on this same highway. The helpless watching as Martha's body surrendered to cancer cell by cell. And now, Thunder, bleeding, wounded, possibly dying, because Michael had once again failed to protect something he loved. Michael's legs gave out as he struggled to reach the struggling figures. His vision blurred, chest pain radiating down his left arm in the unmistakable signature of cardiac distress. The stress of the confrontation, the guilt over Thunder's condition, and the physical shock of witnessing violence had triggered the heart attack he'd been postponing with medications and willful denial. "Thunder," he whispered, crawling across the parking lot gravel toward the dog who continued to pin Rick Morrison despite his wounds. "I'm sorry, boy. I'm so sorry." Rick lay beneath Thunder's weight, the fight draining out of him as reality penetrated his alcohol-clouded mind. The dog's blood was soaking into his shirt, warm and accusatory, while Michael Thompson, the teacher who'd once believed in him, lay gasping 20 feet away. The mathematics of destruction were finally clear. In trying to hurt the one person who'd shown him childhood kindness, Rick had become the very monster he'd always feared he was. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with each labored beat of Michael's failing heart. Thunder struggled to his feet and limped toward his human, leaving Rick Morrison to stare at the night sky while sirens and blood and the weight of irreversible choices pressed down on his chest. Dr. Martinez reached Michael first, her veterinary training providing enough medical knowledge to recognize the severity of his cardiac episode. She pressed her phone into his trembling hand while applying pressure to Thunder's fresh wound with her lab coat. "Stay with me, Mr. Thompson. The ambulance is coming." Thunder collapsed beside Michael, his magnificent head resting on the man's chest, as both of them fought battles their bodies might not win. The dog's labored breathing matched Michael's irregular heartbeat, two damaged creatures who'd found each other too late to prevent this tragedy, but not too late for love. "Good boy," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible over the approaching sirens. "You protected me, didn't you? Just like you protected everyone else." The paramedics arrived to find a scene that would haunt Cedar Creek for years to come: an elderly man in cardiac distress, a wounded police dog refusing to leave his side, and a broken man in handcuffs weeping over the rifle that had shattered 3 lives with 2 bullets. The community's fairy tale about second chances and redemption had collided with the harsh reality that some wounds never heal, some people can't be saved, and love sometimes isn't enough to prevent tragedy. As Michael was loaded into the ambulance, his last conscious sight was Thunder being lifted onto a stretcher by Dr. Martinez and her assistants. The dog's brown eyes found his one final time, conveying forgiveness and loyalty that transcended species and circumstance. Then the morphine claimed Michael's consciousness, and he drifted into darkness, wondering if he'd failed again, if his stubborn belief in salvation had cost Thunder his life just as surely as his inability to save David had cost him his son. In the back of the police cruiser, Rick Morrison sat in handcuffs while his former teacher and the dog he'd tried to kill were rushed toward uncertain fates. The bottle of whiskey that had seemed like courage now tasted like poison, and the rifle that had promised justice had delivered only suffering. At 45, Rick Morrison finally understood the difference between being failed by the world and failing yourself. But the lesson had come at a price that could never be repaid. The Cedar Creek community would wake tomorrow to news that would test every assumption about forgiveness, redemption, and the cost of salvation. Some stories, they would learn, don't have fairy tale endings. They have human ones, complicated by love and loss and the terrible choices that define who we become in our darkest moments. The intensive care unit at Cedar Creek Regional Hospital had become a shrine of waiting and prayer. Michael Thompson lay unconscious beneath a web of monitors and tubes, his weathered face pale against the white pillows while machines tracked the irregular rhythm of a heart that had endured too much loss. The triple bypass surgery had taken 6 hours, during which the entire town seemed to hold its breath, united in concern for the teacher who'd touched so many lives. Dr. Sarah Martinez had spent the night in the veterinary clinic, performing emergency surgery on Thunder, while fielding calls from reporters, well-wishers, and community members demanding updates. The bullet had missed major organs, but shattered bone and torn muscle tissue that would require months of rehabilitation. More concerning was Thunder's refusal to eat, drink, or respond to anyone except the nurses who mentioned Michael's name. "He's grieving," Dr. Martinez explained to Mrs. Henderson, who'd arrived at dawn with a thermos of coffee and desperate eyes. Dogs form profound attachments, especially working dogs like Thunder. He doesn't understand why Michael isn't here, and he's literally giving up without him. The breakthrough came on the third day when Detective Ray Collins arrived at the clinic with evidence that would shatter everything the community thought they knew about Rick Morrison's attack. Collins, who'd worked closely with Thunder during the dog's police service, requested to examine Rick's personal effects and the incident report. What he found in Rick's wallet made his hands shake. Tucked behind Rick's driver's license was a yellowed newspaper clipping from 10 years earlier. Local teacher's son dies in highway accident. The article detailed David Thompson's fatal crash on Highway 21, the same road where Michael had found Thunder. But it was Rick's handwritten notes in the margins that revealed the devastating truth. Dates, times, and the words "I was driving" scrawled in ink that had faded but not disappeared. Detective Collins immediately contacted the State Police Cold Case Division. Within hours, investigators had matched Rick's handwriting to suicide notes he'd written and discarded over the years, each one confessing to leaving the scene of an accident that killed Mr. Thompson's boy. Rick Morrison hadn't just been a troubled former student seeking attention, he'd been the drunk driver who'd killed Michael's son and spent a decade drowning his guilt in alcohol and self-destruction. The confession came in a jail cell at 3 in the morning when Rick's attorney finally convinced him that the evidence was overwhelming. Through tears and trembling hands, Rick admitted to drinking heavily after losing another job, to driving when he should have walked, to seeing David's car too late to prevent the collision. He'd fled the scene in panic, then watched from afar as Michael grieved his son's death, never knowing that his former kindergarten student had been responsible. "I wanted to tell him 1,000 times," Rick sobbed to Detective Collins. "Every time I saw Mr. Thompson at the grocery store, at church, walking past his house. But how do you tell someone you killed their kid? How do you face the one person who believed in you when you've become the monster he tried to save you from being?" The news reached the hospital where Michael was beginning to regain consciousness after his cardiac surgery. Dr. Patricia Walsh, his cardiologist, made the difficult decision to delay telling him about Rick's confession until his condition stabilized. But Michael sensed something was wrong from the expressions of the nurses, the way conversations stopped when he opened his eyes. "Thunder," was the first word Michael spoke clearly, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube. "Where's Thunder?" The reunion happened against all medical advice and hospital protocol. Dr. Martinez transported Thunder to the hospital in violation of every rule governing therapy animals, while Dr. Walsh turned a blind eye to the German Shepherd being wheeled into the cardiac intensive care unit. Thunder had been refusing all food and medication for 4 days, his condition deteriorating as rapidly as his will to live. The moment Thunder's stretcher was positioned beside Michael's bed, both patient and dog showed immediate improvement. Thunder's vital signs stabilized for the first time since the shooting, while Michael's heart monitor displayed the most regular rhythm doctors had recorded since his admission. The bond between man and dog transcended medical explanation, creating a healing environment that no medication could replicate. "I know, boy," Michael whispered, his trembling hand finding Thunder's fur. "I know you saved me." "You've been saving me since that first day on the highway." It was during this tender reunion that Detective Collins arrived with news that would either heal Michael's deepest wounds or destroy what remained of his spirit. Mrs. Henderson and Dr. Martinez flanked Michael's bedside as Collins carefully explained the investigation's findings, watching for any sign that the revelation was too much for his recovering heart. "Mr. Thompson," Collins began, his voice gentle but firm, "we've discovered that Rick Morrison was involved in David's accident 10 years ago. He was the driver who left the scene. He's been carrying that guilt all this time, and it led to his breakdown and the attack on you and Thunder. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for hours. Michael's hand continued stroking Thunder's head while his mind processed information that recontextualized a decade of grief. The hit-and-run driver he'd fantasized about confronting, the faceless monster who'd stolen his son's future, had been a broken child he'd once tried to nurture. "He was drinking," Michael said finally, not a question but a statement of understanding. "He's been drinking to forget what he did to David." Collins nodded. "His confession is complete. The district attorney is preparing charges for vehicular manslaughter, leaving the scene of an accident and the recent assault. He'll likely spend 15 to 20 years in prison." Michael closed his eyes, feeling the weight of forgiveness settling over him like one of Martha's quilts. The anger he'd carried, the rage at injustice and random cruelty, was being replaced by something more complex. Rick Morrison hadn't been a stranger who'd destroyed their family. He'd been another casualty of circumstances, another broken person whose pain had created more pain in an endless cycle of suffering. "I want to see him," Michael said, ignoring the protests from Dr. Walsh and Mrs. Henderson. "Before he's sentenced, I want to talk to Rick Morrison." The request created controversy throughout Cedar Creek. Some residents, led by Patricia Hendricks, argued that Rick deserved no compassion after years of hiding his crime and then attacking the very man he'd wronged. Others, including many of Michael's former teaching colleagues, understood his need for closure and reconciliation. Thunder's recovery accelerated alongside Michael's emotional healing. The dog's police training had included psychological resilience, and once reunited with his human partner, his physical wounds began healing with remarkable speed. Dr. Martinez documented the case for veterinary journals, noting how the human-animal bond had literally kept both patient and dog alive through their darkest hours. The conversation between Michael and Rick took place in the county jail's visitor room, with Thunder present as an officially designated therapy animal. Rick could barely look at his former teacher, his face bearing the ravages of a decade of guilt and self-destruction. But Michael's first words were not what either man expected. "I forgive you, Rick," Michael said simply. "For David, for Thunder, for all of it. You were 6 years old when I knew you, and you've been carrying a man's burden ever since. It's time to put it down." Rick's breakdown was complete and cathartic. Years of suppressed grief pouring out in sobs that shook the reinforced glass between them. He talked about the nightmares, the failed marriages destroyed by his drinking, the jobs lost to depression and guilt. He'd been dying slowly for 10 years, and the attack on Michael had been a desperate attempt to end his suffering by forcing someone else to end it for him. "I don't deserve forgiveness," Rick whispered. "I killed your son and spent 10 years watching you grieve what I'd done." "Forgiveness isn't about deserving," Michael replied, his teacher's wisdom finally finding its purpose again. "It's about letting go of poison that kills both the victim and the perpetrator. David wouldn't want his death to destroy another life, even yours." Thunder, sensing the emotional weight of the moment, approached the glass that separated the two men and placed his paw against it. Rick stared at the dog he'd shot, the animal whose devotion had saved Michael's life, and finally understood the difference between justice and mercy. The revelation transformed Cedar Creek's understanding of their story. What had seemed like a simple tale of redemption and second chances revealed itself as something far more complex, a meditation on guilt, forgiveness, and the interconnected nature of human suffering. Rick Morrison would serve his sentence, but he would serve it as a man finally freed from the secret that had been killing him slowly for a decade. Michael's recovery, both physical and emotional, accelerated with the lifting of his deepest burden. The questions that had haunted him, why David, why Martha, why him, were replaced by an understanding that some tragedies create opportunities for healing that wouldn't exist otherwise. Rick Morrison's confession had given him something he'd never expected to find: the chance to forgive the unforgivable and discover grace in the darkest places. 6 months after the shooting that nearly claimed 2 lives, Michael Thompson stood in his backyard watching Thunder teach Max and Duke the finer points of perimeter patrol. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grass that Martha had once tended, now transformed into a proper training ground for 3 German shepherds who had become the unofficial guardians of Maple Street. At 69, Michael moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned not to take his health for granted, but his eyes held a vitality that had been absent for years. Thunder's recovery had been nothing short of miraculous. The police dog's training and natural resilience had accelerated his healing beyond every medical prediction, though he still favored his left shoulder on cold mornings. More importantly, his trust in humans had been restored through Michael's patient consistency. The nightmares that had plagued him during his initial recovery had faded, replaced by the confident alertness of a dog who knew his purpose and his place in the world. Max and Duke had grown into magnificent adolescents, their puppy awkwardness replaced by the powerful grace characteristic of their breed. At 8 months old, they weighed 60 pounds each and showed every sign of reaching Thunder's impressive size. Under the older dog's tutelage, they'd learned not just obedience but the subtle art of protection, how to position themselves between Michael and potential threats, how to read human body language for signs of aggression, how to bark with authority when necessary and remain silent when stealth was required. The transformation of Michael's house reflected the dramatic changes in his life. Where once empty rooms had echoed with loneliness, now the sounds of family filled every corner. Dog beds in the living room, food bowls lined up in the kitchen, and toys scattered across the hardwood floors that Martha had kept spotless. The spare bedroom had been converted into a home office where Michael managed the Martha Thunder Foundation, the nonprofit organization that had grown from community donations into a regional force for animal rescue and rehabilitation. The foundation's success had been staggering. What began as a grassroots effort to help with Thunder's medical bills had evolved into a comprehensive program providing veterinary care for animals whose owners couldn't afford treatment. The initial GoFundMe campaign had raised $47,000, far exceeding the medical expenses. Michael had used the surplus to establish a permanent fund, leveraging his decades of experience managing classroom budgets to stretch every donated dollar to its maximum impact. Dr. Sarah Martinez had become more than Thunder's veterinarian. She'd become Michael's partner in both the foundation and in life. Their relationship had developed gradually, built on shared commitment to animal welfare and mutual respect for each other's professional expertise. At 53, Sarah was a widow herself, having lost her husband to cancer 3 years earlier. Their courtship had been conducted in veterinary clinics and foundation board meetings, with Thunder serving as an approving chaperone who seemed to understand that his human needed companionship beyond what even the most devoted dog could provide. The wedding had taken place in Martha's rose garden, which Michael and Sarah had restored to its former glory. Thunder served as ring-bearer, his dignity intact despite the small satin pillow attached to his collar, while Max and Duke flanked the couple as unofficial ushers. The ceremony was small. 50 guests, including Michael's former teaching colleagues, Sarah's veterinary staff, and most of Cedar Creek's population over 60. But the joy was enormous. Mrs. Henderson wept openly during the vows, declaring it the most beautiful thing she'd seen since Martha's own wedding 35 years ago. The foundation had become Michael's second career, utilizing skills he'd never known he possessed. His experience managing classroom dynamics translated perfectly to coordinating volunteers, while his teacher's ability to communicate complex concepts in simple terms made him a natural spokesperson for animal welfare causes. The Foundation's monthly newsletter, written in Michael's clear, compassionate prose, reached 12,000 subscribers across Texas and neighboring states. Thunder's role in the organization extended far beyond mascot. The police dog's training and intelligence made him an ideal candidate for therapy work, and Dr. Martinez had certified him for visits to nursing homes, children's hospitals, and rehabilitation centers. His calm presence and intuitive understanding of human distress had brought comfort to hundreds of people facing their own battles with trauma and loss. Max and Duke were following similar training paths, their natural empathy enhanced by careful socialization and professional instruction. The most profound change, however, was in Michael himself. The depression that had consumed him after Martha and David's deaths had been replaced by a sense of purpose he'd never experienced, even during his teaching career. The foundation work provided intellectual challenge, emotional fulfillment, and the satisfaction of tangible results. Every animal they helped, every family they supported, represented a victory over the despair that had once threatened to destroy him. Rick Morrison's influence on their story continued even from prison. His confession had brought closure not just to David's case but to several other hit-and-run incidents that had remained unsolved. His genuine remorse and cooperation with authorities had earned him a sentence of 15 years rather than the 25 he might have faced, and his participation in the state prison's dog training program had begun his own rehabilitation journey. Michael visited Rick quarterly, bringing updates about the foundation and sometimes Thunder himself, whose presence seemed to calm the guilt that still haunted Rick's nights. These visits were difficult but necessary, part of Michael's commitment to forgiveness as an active practice rather than a passive emotion. Rick had begun corresponding with families of other victims, making amends where possible and sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the devastating consequences of drunk driving. The ripple effects of their story had spread far beyond Cedar Creek. Michael had been invited to speak at conferences about human-animal bonds, grief recovery, and community resilience. His natural teaching ability made him an effective speaker, and his authenticity, the obvious depth of his own healing, gave weight to his words. The foundation had received inquiries from similar communities seeking guidance on establishing their own animal welfare programs. Thunder's police service had been formally honored with a monument in the town square, a bronze statue depicting a German shepherd in alert pose with an inscription reading, "Thunder, Badge K9 447, served with honor, saved with love." The dedication ceremony had drawn attendees from across the state, including former colleagues from the Austin Police Department who remembered Thunder's courage and effectiveness during his active duty years. The house on Maple Street had become an unofficial community center, with foundation volunteers meeting in the living room where Martha once hosted bridge games. Sarah's veterinary expertise complemented Michael's organizational skills, and together they'd created a model that other communities were beginning to replicate. The spare bedroom served as an office where Michael managed correspondence with supporters, veterinarians, and rescue organizations across the region. Max and Duke had developed distinct personalities that delighted Michael daily. Max, the larger and more confident of the two, had inherited Thunder's protective instincts and natural leadership abilities. Duke, smaller but more intuitive, showed remarkable empathy and seemed destined for therapy work, like his adoptive father. Both dogs had been featured in the Foundation's promotional materials, their puppy-to-adolescent transformation symbolizing hope and renewal. The financial stability that had once seemed impossible was now secure. Michael's modest teacher's pension, combined with Sarah's veterinary practice income and the Foundation's careful management, provided comfort they'd both thought beyond reach. The house's mortgage had been paid off with Foundation surplus funds designated for Michael's housing security, ensuring that their home base for animal rescue work would remain stable regardless of future challenges. Community support continued to amaze them both. The monthly Thunderburger sales at the local diner had become a tradition, with regular customers timing their visits to contribute to the cause. The high school had made the foundation their official community service partner, with students volunteering for everything from fundraising to hands-on animal care. The Methodist Church had established an annual Blessing of the Animals service, with Thunder, Max, and Duke serving as honored guests. The most meaningful transformation was in Michael's relationship with faith itself. The bitterness and questioning that had followed Martha and David's deaths had evolved into something deeper and more nuanced. His daily prayers now included gratitude for Thunder's survival, for Sarah's love, for the community's support, and even for Rick Morrison's eventual redemption. The God he'd once accused of cruelty had revealed himself through the loyalty of a wounded dog and the compassion of strangers who'd rallied to help. As evening approached and the three dogs settled into their familiar positions around Michael's chair, Thunder at his feet, Max and Duke flanking either side, Michael reflected on the improbable journey that had brought them all together. The man who'd driven Highway 21 6 months earlier to reluctantly visit a cardiologist bore little resemblance to the foundation director now planning their next community outreach program. Sarah emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee, her presence still capable of surprising Michael with its simple perfection. They'd learned to navigate the complexities of blending 2 lives that had been shaped by loss, creating new traditions while honoring the memories of those they'd loved before. Martha's rose garden bloomed under Sarah's care, while her husband's collection of veterinary journals had found new purpose in Michael's foundation research. The phone calls still came daily, requests for help, offers of support, updates from other rescue organizations, and occasionally reporters seeking follow-up stories about the teacher and the police dog whose bond had captured national attention. Michael handled each call with the patience and thoroughness that had made him an exceptional educator, understanding that their story belonged to more than just themselves now. Thunder lifted his head from his paws and looked directly at Michael, those intelligent brown eyes conveying the wordless communication they'd developed over months of shared experience. In that gaze, Michael saw recognition, gratitude, and the simple contentment of a dog who knew he was exactly where he belonged. The 2 damaged souls who'd found each other on a dusty Texas highway had not just survived their trauma, they'd transformed it into purpose, meaning, and hope. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky above Cedar Creek, Michael Thompson understood that some stories don't end. They simply evolve into new chapters, each one richer and more meaningful than the last. Thunder's gentle snoring, Sarah's quiet presence, and Max and Duke's protective alertness created a symphony of belonging that filled the spaces where loneliness had once lived. At 69, Michael had learned that love indeed multiplies rather than divides, that family can be chosen as well as inherited, and that sometimes angels really do have 4 legs and fur coats. The foundation they'd built would continue long after they were gone, but for now, in this moment, there was perfect peace in knowing that broken things could indeed be made beautiful again. At 68, Michael Thompson thought his story was over. Widowed, childless, living alone in a house full of memories that cut deeper with each passing day. His Social Security barely covered the bills. His purpose seemed finished, and every morning felt like another step toward irrelevance. Sound familiar? Then 2 German Shepherd puppies standing on a Texas highway changed everything. They led him to Thunder, a wounded police dog who needed saving just as desperately as Michael needed something to live for. What followed wasn't just a rescue. It was a complete life transformation. Michael discovered that his teacher's heart still had wisdom to give, that his modest savings could work miracles, and that family doesn't always look like you expect. Today, The Martha Thunder Foundation has saved over 200 animals. Michael has found love again with Dr. Sarah Martinez, and their home overflows with purpose, laughter, and the pitter-patter of paws on hardwood floors. The man who thought he was too old for new beginnings learned that sometimes your greatest chapter starts when you think the book is closing. Love multiplies. It never divides. At any age, your next family might be waiting for you to say yes to an unexpected chance to serve something bigger than your loneliness. Questions for engagement. Have you ever found unexpected purpose or family later in life? What opened that door for you? What would you do if you encountered a situation like Michael's? Would you stop to help even if it meant sacrificing your security? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else to take that leap of faith.